Welcome, everyone, to tonight's talk, The Plot, a conversation with renowned writer Hanff Korelitz. We're thrilled to have Jean with us tonight to talk about her latest book, The Plot, which is a New York Times bestseller. Hailed as breathtakingly suspenseful, The Plot is about a story too good not to steal and the writer who steals it. Stephen King wrote that the plot is insanely readable and the suspense quotient is through the roof. It's remarkable. Korelitz also wrote the book You Should Have Known, which became the New York Times, which is the bestseller that's inspired the most talked about TV series of 2020, HBO's The Undoing, which was adapted by David E. Kelley and stars Nicole Kidman and Hugh Grant. And this is her seventh book, I think. She's also the author of other books, including Admission, which was adapted into a film starring Tina Fey, Lily Tomlin, and Paul Rudd. And she also has a company called Book the Writer and hosts pop-up book groups in which small groups of readers discuss new books with their authors. And I've been a part of some of those programs and they're remarkable. And her new novel, The Latecomer, will be published by Celadon Books in 2022. Jean is a graduate of Dartmouth College and Cambridge University. She has strong Princeton roots as well. She lives in New York City with her husband, Irish poet and Princeton professor Paul Muldoon, and she has two children, one of whom is a student at Princeton. And she also worked for the admissions office at Princeton for a while, which we'll talk about a little later. And I'm Wendy Gerber, CEO of the International Consulting Group, a global strategy and marketing consulting firm, driving business growth for many of the world's leading corporations with a triple bottom line approach. I've worked with companies and organizations, including Ralph Lauren, Citigroup, Kenneth Cole, and the Rockefeller Foundation. I'm also a member of the board of directors of Conscious Capitalism New York City and graduated from Princeton and New York University Law School, as well as attending the Wharton School. Tonight, we'll be discussing Jean's books, the writing process, and what it's like to have her books adapted for TV and film. Before we start our talk, I want to thank our co-sponsors, the Princeton Club of New York, as well as Princeton Arts Alumni, Princeton in Hollywood, and Conscious Capitalism, New York City. Tonight, we'll be chatting for about 45 minutes, and then Jean will answer questions from the audience for about 15 minutes. So please remember to click on the Q&A tab and type your questions into the box, and we'll get to as many as we can. So I thought we'd start with your background and journey, Jean. What first got you interested in writing books?
Wow. For me, it went all the way back to elementary school. I loved language, and it was always just a very high goal to be able to write, especially fiction, because fiction just was transporting. But bizarrely, I did about a 10-year segue through poetry before I even attempted to write fiction. So, you know, I think, we always want to try to succeed at the things we find personally beautiful and satisfying. That was always literature for me. I still have I have very few marketable skills. My first job was at Crone Chocolatier in New York, so I'm very good at making chocolate dipped strawberries, but apart from that, my only marketable skill is writing novels.
Well, it's a great skill, and you're certainly successful at it. And you're now a New York Times best-selling author with The Plot. But has the journey always been easy? You said
Oh
in a
God,
recent
no.
conversation with Scott Turow that writers carry around their sales history like Marley's Chain and A Christmas Carol. Can you explain about this?
Sure. The way publishing works, and I don't know how long this has been the case. Well, actually, I do know how long this has been the case. I'd say since the 70s or 80s. Before that, it seemed as if you had all the time in the world to become a successful, at least in terms of sales, novelist. People would just like keep publishing you, but something changed, certainly before I came along. And, since certainly the 1980s, you don't have endless chances to have the support of a publisher. If you haven't found an audience by your, I don't know, maybe second or third at the most novel, you're probably not going to have the support of that publisher or any other publisher afterwards. And in my case, I was so lucky because even though my sales history was pretty bad, I did not have a huge success. I always found one editor who was willing to take a chance on whatever the new book that I'd written was. And for the last 4 books, I've been with the same editor. I've moved with her from between publishers, but we have history together, and um, she certainly supported me through less successful books.
Now it's astonishing. Even You Should Have Known, which became such a hit with Nicole Kidman. What did that book sell well?
It was certainly my most successful book until the plot, but it wasn't all that successful. And then the one I wrote after that, like nobody read. So I mean, there are no guarantees in this world. And frankly, I was talking to somebody about this today. If you love a book and you go rushing out to buy that author's next book and you don't love it, that's it. I mean, you're not going to go back for the next one after that. We all are aware of how precious the time to read is. We don't have time to read every book in the world, and we're going to be selective. And if evidence suggests that we're not going to like that author's next book, we're going to move on to something unknown, to an unknown person, so that we can experience a new writer. And that's completely human and understandable.
And how was that on a personal level, just coming down from the excitement of You Should Have Known to then have your next book not be that popular? Was that hugely disappointing? Do you have any
Yeah.
thoughts about why that was?
I know. Well, I from a practical standpoint, I know why it was. It was because my editor had left the publisher, and there was nobody there to champion the book.
Uh,
Um, Ironically, I mean, I think it was a very suspenseful book, and there were lots of great twists and turns in it. It was also a novel set on a college campus, and very timely in terms of what it was about, and the kind of identity politics that we've seen on college campuses. So it was current, it was twisty and suspenseful, and nobody knew it was there. So and that was really beyond my control. People would say to me, "Oh, I loved You Should Have Known. When's your next book coming out?" And I would say 3 years ago.
oh
That's
gosh.
so. But you have to you have to remind yourself in moments like that you can control only one thing, and that is the book, um, how the book is written, how effective it is. And the wonderful thing about books is that they don't change. They're not they may be sitting on the shelf in the bookstore, but they're not changing. They're exactly the same as when they landed there. So if somebody is only just discovering me with my 7th novel, numbers 1 through 6, they're right there. They're totally available, and I hope you enjoy them. Only don't read the first one, because that I probably wouldn't suggest them to be the first
And we'll be sharing links to all of Jean's books in a follow-up email after this talk. So you're living a life in the arts, and you live with your husband who's a poet. So you're really surrounded by the arts, writing, and creativity, both professionally and personally. And I'm curious how this is for you. I read in an interview that you spent a day during COVID with you and Paul writing, and your 2 children also writing. Is
one.
writing
That's
now
right.
becoming a
It
family?
was just, it was a happy day.
It was what?
Uh, all four of us are writers, and that is just gives me incredible joy. Would it be nice if somebody were a venture capitalist so they could support the other three? Yeah, probably. But our son in particular, who is a was a member of the class of 21, Princeton 21, is now a member of the class of Princeton 23. Um, has been writing since he was a teenager. He wants to write musical theater. He is writing musical theater. He's writing for Triangle on campus, but he's writing musicals on his own. Our daughter is a songwriter and was later to that than the other three members of our family, but is now very committed to exploring that. It was just a great day where I had a good writing day, my husband had a good writing day, and at various points during the day, both of our kids called and said, "I just had a great writing day." So I just felt so lucky.
Yeah, what a rewarding experience.
Yeah.
So, throughout your newest book, The Plot, which we'll get into more detail shortly, several characters posit that writing can't be taught. As a writer, do you agree or disagree with that?
I would have said that it can't be taught, but my husband, who does teach creative writing at Princeton, disagrees with me. He feels that it can be taught up to a point. Um, Anybody who's tried to learn an instrument knows that if they study and practice, they get better. Um, why shouldn't that be true of writing? I didn't personally get an MFA. Um, Neither did my husband. But I've had friends who had wonderful experiences in their MFA programs. They learned a lot, they became better writers. I interviewed a woman only last week for Book the Writer, and she told us a story about how the huge transformation in her work as a writer happened not even in the classroom at Columbia in her MFA program, but afterwards in a conversation literally as they were walking out of the class. One of her classmates said something to her which completely transformed her way of writing and the way she thought about writing and led directly to the books that she's writing now. So I mean there is an argument that going to an MFA program and getting an MFA degree is about more than what happens in the classroom. So that seems to me a very reasonable argument. And again, I haven't experienced it myself, so I cannot. I'm not going to be snooty about it. Although in the book, I'm pretty snooty about it, I must say. So I
So
do poke a
now
little.
let's talk about the plot and the big news around the plot. With the launch of your new book on May 11th this year, you became a New York Times best-selling author. You told the Hollywood Reporter in an interview about the plot, "This is my seventh novel, and I've never seen a kind of pre-publication temperature like this." So what's happened over the past 2 months? How have you felt? And what's been the impact of making the New York Times bestseller list?
Well, my agent and my publisher uh, are making fun of me for one thing because they apparently, and I totally forgot this, you should have known did make the bestseller list for about a second and a half. But I put it out of my mind. I mean, it was so fleeting that it was over before I was even aware of it. Um, but what happened this time was this publisher really put so much effort into the pre-publication period, and they used the internet in a way that I've never seen before. They reached readers. Uh, they reached the right readers, and they got galleys of the novel into their hands. And those people read the book and they liked the book and they talked about the book. So then there was this kind of swell of attention. And you started hearing things like, I've seen this book everywhere, or I keep hearing about this book, and everybody's talking about this book. That has never happened to me before. Um, I'm always aware of what the big books of the moment are, the half a dozen books that everybody's talking about. It's never been my book, but this time it was, and it was great. I loved it. So, then the worry is, oh gosh, when all these people are going to actually read the book, they're not going to like it. They're going to say it doesn't live up to the hype. That didn't really happen. So,
Well, it's fascinating because it really shows that, yeah, the writing of the book is critical, but the marketing is also very important in terms of getting the word out. So, one of the blurbs that's at the top of a lot of Celadon's marketing is a quote by Stephen King, who wrote that the plot is one of the best novels I've ever read about writers and writing, and the suspense quotient is through the roof. How did you get Stephen King to read it and write a review?
Well, I will tell you that story. It is a Princeton story, ironically enough. But I want to preface that by saying that my relationship to blurbs, which is what this is, these quotes, is very uneasy. I'm anti-blurb. I think blurbs are, on the whole, not good for publishing. Um, Anybody who wants to know why I feel that way should look at the old Spy magazine of the 1980s, which used to have a fabulous feature called Log Rolling in Our Time, where they would have two columns, one with author A talking about author B, and then author B talking about author A. And it was just so crass and cynical and tacky and gross. And I do, luckily, I have other ways to support books that I love, especially Book the Writer, but I do not do blurbs, and I do not ask for blurbs. So when my publisher came to me and said, "We insist, you have to do this," I said, I started chipping away at my principles immediately, and what I said was, I will only uh, approach writers I A, do not know personally, and B, uh, genuinely admire. Um, and that, believe it or not, that was two people. There were two people that fit those categories, that Venn diagram. Authors I admire, authors I didn't know. And in that little Venn diagram were Stephen King and Megan Abbott. And I didn't know Stephen King, but I know Joyce Carol Oates, and she knows Stephen King, and I wrote to her. Obviously, Joyce, a writer I deeply admire, was not somebody I could approach for a blurb because I knew her. Um, and I said, if I wrote an email, would you forward it? And she did. And he said, sounds great, but I'm very, busy, and I can't promise anything. So a galley was sent to him, and then nothing happened for many months. And frankly, I stopped hoping anything would happen. And literally the day that the cover was going to press, he suddenly burst out of nowhere with this amazing quote that my editor literally had to say, "Stop the presses," and they did. And I still can't believe it. I mean, I pretty much just took to my bed. I was so thrilled that he had said that. I admire him so much. So amazing.
Have you talked to him since?
No, no. I mean, I thanked him, of course, but
It's
uh,
remarkable, and it's a great story about how you never know how things will turn out at the very last minute.
yeah.
Thank you, something that was really wonderful. So let's talk a bit about the plot itself. Can you set up the story for us and share how you got the idea to write it? What inspired you?
So I have written novels that I literally thought about for 20 years before I wrote the first word. This was not one of them. Only twice in my life as a writer have I just had an idea that came out of nowhere. The last one was You Should Have Known. I was on Nassau Street. I was walking down Nassau Street when I had that idea. I remember exactly where I was. I was right in front of the Indian restaurant, Mehek, on Nassau Street and Van Deventer. Um, in case that's of interest to any of you Princetonians. This one, it just kind of popped into my head in January of 2020, which was not a fun month on many levels, but it was an especially not fun month for me because I I was very starting to really panic about this virus that I was reading about in China. And I was very upset about the impeachment. And I was very upset because my editor was not buying the book that I was writing, literally not buying it. And um, I was in her office having a meeting, a very unpleasant meeting about why she wasn't buying the book. This is the latecomer. And in the middle of this meeting, I just started telling her the story of this other idea. And I could see her get very excited about this idea. And the next day, she bought both books, which was such an amazing, incredible thing to happen. I had never had a two-book contract. I'd never had that kind of security. And it was just, wow, it was fantastic. So, but how did I get inspired? I mean, it really was like a lightning bolt. I cannot, it's not like with some of my other books, I can tell you the story that I heard, the idea that I had, in some cases, the other book that was transformed into what I wrote, or the other story. I mean, I've written novels that were based on other stories. I mean, my novel, The Sabbath Day River, is largely based on The Scarlet Letter. And my novel, The White Rose, is largely based on the Strauss opera Der Rosenkavalier. So these are things that we do. These are things that writers do all the time. And in both those cases, I thought about those stories for many years before I wrote. But this was like, boom, it was there.
So that brings up my next question, which is that the plot has a tantalizing quandary at its core. Who owns the story and what's fair in writing? And I'm curious about your thoughts on that. And also, do you think you'd ever steal a genius idea for a book if you knew it would never be used by the initial author?
Well, like I just said, I've done that. I mean, I took Strauss's Der Rosenkavalier. He's not using it again, you know. He used it already. Uh, I think this is a challenging thing for non-writers to get their minds around, and I understand that. But for writers and other artists, composers, painters, choreographers, everything is in conversation with everything else. We are in a river. We didn't start the river. The river will not stop with us. Everything is mixing together, and part of the artistry is to take stories that go way back, farther back than we go, back to the beginning of storytelling, and we do something with those stories that only we can do. So, Cold Mountain is based on the Odyssey. So is Ulysses based on the Odyssey. The Lion King is based on Hamlet. I mean, you can decide that you want to pull these strands apart and excise the ones that have been used before, but you will be left with a very empty bookshelf. And you will probably not like the books that are left. So either you can knowingly accept that this is how we make stories, or you can not accept it, but it's still going to be true whether you accept it or not. So these are the issues that we writers obsess about. They are completely enmeshed with ideas about plagiarism, because in our world, theft is plagiarism. I don't know how many of your audience is aware of this, but we happen to be in a moment right now where we are dissecting a New Yorker story called Cat Person, which came out several years ago. It was a hugely popular story. And literally a few days ago, a woman wrote an article in Slate in which she says, this character in Cat Person is based on me. And many people will come up to writers and say, you stole my life and that's based on me. And what they mean is that that character reminded me of myself or something that happened to me coincidentally. But in this case, it really was based on her. There was a connection between this young woman and another character in the story and the author, who heard all about the situation and adapted it as a short story. So the those of you who are not doing time on Twitter among the writers, if you want to just go to Twitter and look up cat person, you will see a lot of joking, a lot of snark, and a lot of kind of interesting deep discussion about what does this mean for fiction? What are we allowed to say? What precautions should we take in order to protect somebody and protect ourselves, frankly? So, these are the kinds of things that we obsess about, but I'm not sure if anybody else really cares.
Let's talk a little bit about your writing process. I know you mentioned that you should have known you were walking down Nassau Street, you got this idea. How do you then capture those ideas so you don't forget them? And how do you work? Do you outline your books first?
No, it's actually it's it's the same answer to both those questions. You don't out or I don't outline, um, and I don't try to capture it, because if you know everything before you start to write your book, it will be so boring and dry and rote and kind of connect the index cards. This is, I'm describing it for me. It may be different for somebody else, but you want to know enough to begin. And it's not terrible to have a kind of a vague idea of where things are going, but you don't want to know everything, because you want to discover it as you go. Most of the plot I didn't know until I wrote it. So it's the idea. It's that what if. A lot of books begin with a what if. In the case of You Should Have Known, what if there was a therapist whose whole thing was to tell women to pay attention to uh, what people are really showing them. And then in her own life, she's completely, clueless about what is really going on in her life. What would that be like? What about the hubris of telling people how to live their lives when you're such a disaster yourself? That is interesting.
So, in the plot, a struggling writer steals a plot from a student and his life changes overnight. Suddenly, he's the toast of the literary community, a household name, but someone knows what he did and wants revenge. So, did you know how you wanted to end the plot when you started writing it? Was that the what if, did you envision different endings to it?
I did. I wasn't sure what would happen. I think, and again, this is a hard book to talk about because it's so easy to give things away, and we don't want to do that. But it became clearer and clearer as I wrote it that there were not that many possible endings. So, it's hard to write a suspenseful novel that will keep people in suspense and also satisfy them once all the cards are on the table. It's a very tall order. I've actually never tried to do it before. For all that You Should Have Known was presented as a thriller and a whodunit, in its television version, written by Princeton graduate David E. Kelley, by the way. Um, it never was that as a book. It was never about who did it. It was always very clear who did it, and it was really about her. I mean, my novel was about the character that Nicole Kidman ended up playing.
So, the characters in all your books are so incredibly well developed. What's your secret for how you give them such depth?
Well, thank you. That's really great to hear. I don't know if there's a secret. I just think really long and hard about them, and I'm interested in lies, and I'm interested in lies that we tell ourselves. And a lot of our suffering, I'm sure, comes down to the dissembling that we do. And Christopher Ricks, who was a professor of English at Cambridge when I was studying there, and I think he's been at Boston University for 30 years now. He wrote a book called Keats and Embarrassment, in which he argued that embarrassment is the most powerful human emotion. Embarrassment makes people behave the way they behave. Um, I think that might be true.
That's really interesting. So, how much of your real life experiences do you bring to your books? You've written, as you said, about a therapist, and You Should Have Known. And I have to say, the insights about relationships were so good. I was highlighting points in the book.
Good.
And you wrote about a Princeton admissions officer in admission and a writer in the plot. How much research do you have to do, and how much comes from your life experiences?
I'm not a big researcher. I don't enjoy research. I think if I had enjoyed research, I might have ended up in academia, but I never liked it. My feeling is always write until you can't write the next sentence without finding something out that you don't know, and then find it out, and then just keep going. Um, I I don't write autobiographically. I mean, I've never written a character knowingly based on myself, nor do I have any wish to. But there are little bits and pieces of our experience that end up, in in the books that we write. I was just talking to a book group, and they asked me if any of the horrible things that happened to Jake in his early career in the plot were based on my early career as a writer. All the humiliating things that happened to him. Some of them happened to me. There was only one thing in the plot that came directly from my own experience, and it happened again in Princeton. I was giving a reading at the local Barnes and Noble in Princeton, and just as the woman was introducing me, she said, she said to me, "I read the beginning and the end of your book, and it was just great." Just, oh my goodness, are you in the wrong job? Do not ever say that to anybody. Of course, I didn't say that. It would have been very rude
Right.
to say that to her. But really, I mean, the heights of humiliation that we experience as writers, just how can you not put those in your book? They're just too fun. So there are little bits and pieces that slip in here and there, but that doesn't mean it's autobiographical.
Well, in terms of the therapist, and you should have known, had you talked to therapists to get these profound insights you incorporated into the
I
book?
didn't have to talk to therapists because I grew up with one. Every dinner was a therapy session. So, my mother was a therapist. She's retired now, but she loved her work, and she had a fascination with sociopaths, as which she passed along to her children. Um, and she was particularly fascinated by women, brilliant women, who could not see that the person in front of them was was meant harm for her in all kinds of ways, financial, romantic, emotional. So my mother would come home, and she'd say, she wouldn't tell us obviously the names of her patients, but she would say, "I have a brilliant patient. She went to Princeton. She went to Harvard Law School. She runs a company with 500 people under her. She's a millionaire. She does the New York Times crossword puzzle. I don't know. But there's her husband is cheating on her, lying to her, stealing from her. I know this. It is obvious to me. And she does not know it. She will not see it. And how can such a brilliant, brilliant woman be this stupid?" And, it was just a fascinating question. That is a lifelong question. And that is a question that has gone into a number of my books. It's not always a woman and her husband, but how can we how can we invest people with this kind of distorted reality for our own comfort? What is that like when that falls apart?
Well, that's fascinating. And what did you do for admission? This is going to interest our audience. How did you research Princeton admissions, and how did you pick Princeton to be the university you were focused on, having gone to Dartmouth undergrad?
Yes, I am a proud Dartmouth graduate. I want to make a special point of that. Uh, uh, Perhaps I should also say I did not get into Princeton, so just to be super clear about that. But I was a faculty spouse at Princeton. I love Princeton. I have reverence for Princeton. In fact, one of the most consistent criticisms of admission as a novel was that it was just a big long puff piece for Princeton, which is fine with me because I think it's a great, great, great university. And I also love and respect um, the students, my husband's students. I saw a generation of students come through his classroom and my home because they often came out and we would meet them. Um, I have always been interested in admissions. I vividly remember the emotions of going through it myself. It was a tough experience. Uh, and I found that as I watched a whole generation of Princeton students kind of go past, that I was more and more interested in these students and the mechanism by which they were admitted to Princeton and universities like Princeton. So I went to Dean Janet Rapoli, who was the Dean of Admissions then, and I said, I want to write a novel about Ivy League admissions. And I knew that they hired, they call them outside readers to read applications because there are just so many. You just need more eyes on the applications. And she hired me, and we were trained. And then, I worked at home. I would come in and get files, take them home, write them up, bring them back, take more files. I loved it. I absolutely loved it. I really loved the kids. I mean, they're just obviously they're putting their best feet forward, but it is so reassuring to read these applications from these kids because they are so smart, they are so decent, they really want to learn, they want to make an impact on the world. It's a great kind of boost if you're worried about the future to read college applications from the kinds of students who apply to Princeton.
And what was the university's reaction to the book when it was finished?
I don't know that there was an official reaction. I know that Dean Rapoli did not like the book. Um, when it came time to, oh, and you were asking why it was called Princeton. I will say that initially, when I was writing admission, I called it something else. I think I called it Nassau University or something like that. And then I thought it's reading a satire, and I really didn't want to write that book. There were other satirical books about college admissions. It is so easy to make fun of this system, of the impact on parents. But it's not funny. If anybody who's watching has gone through it with their kids, they know it's not fun and it's not funny. And these are real emotions. And also, uh, it's too easy to just kind of waggle your finger at the high schools and the parents. Um, I don't have to be from a Princeton family. This goes back 6 generations of kids attending Princeton to feel the pain that you would feel if this kid is the first one not to get in. I mean, that must be absolutely devastating. I'm not going to make fun of that. Um, on the other hand, to understand the power of what Princeton can can do in somebody's life, it really is a magical door for many, many people, many, many deserving people who are going to absolutely use the experience. So I didn't want to write a satire. I mean, there are a bunch of them out there. Go read them. They're fun. I read them, but I didn't want to write one.
So now I'd love to get into the fact that you have very successfully been able to publish books that then are picked up and adapted into films and series. So 7 novels so far. You Should Have Known was adapted into the HBO series The Undoing. Admission was adapted into a film starring Tina Fey. What's been the most exciting part of seeing your novels adapted for the screen?
Definitely the most exciting part is walking onto a film set and seeing all these people running around and doing stuff you don't even know what they're doing, and realizing that they're all there because of something you wrote in your pajamas, and it's just like the greatest thing in the world. At the same time, you are deeply unimportant on the set itself. You are the least important person. um, I was introduced to a bunch of people on the Undoing set as the writer of the book. And I kid you not, that the most common thing they said was, "There's a book." So, I, I think not Tina Fey, uh, Nicole Kidman's driver was literally the only person who came up to me and said, I loved your book. I just loved your book. And I'm like, thank you so much. Wow. Oh, and one of the guys who played one of the cops, the Irish cop, who's a real cop in real life, he read the book and he really loved it too. So, uh, yeah, that was, but mostly it's like, oh, there's a book, or they think you're writing like the novelization. The novelization of The Undoing. Yeah. So it's
Well,
kind of it's very thrilling, and you feel very important and kind of like, wow, good for me. I did all this. None of you would be here if not for me. On the other hand, you were the lowest of the low on the set, so it's quite humbling.
and it was such a huge success. The finale last December drew the biggest one night audience for an HBO series in over a year, 4 Golden Globe nominations, including Best Limited Series or Movie Made for Television. How much input were you able to have in the final result?
Do you see this? That's how much. Zero. Zero. There was nothing. I had nothing. It was all David E. Kelly, and he told me from the outset, it's going to be different from the book. It's going to be more of a whodunit. And the Jonathan character, who is barely in the book, is one of the most important characters. So I was like, great, do what you want. I mean, look, I've only been watching the guy's work since L.A. Law, so
Right. Well,
it's
I
not
know you had already gone through this with your book Admission, which
right.
was made into Tina Fey's film, but what did it feel like to have your baby in other people's hands? And were you nervous to see the final series? Did David Kelly share it with you in advance?
He shared the scripts of all of the episodes except for the last one. And when the pandemic began, the original release date for The Undoing was that May. It was supposed to come out in May of 2020. And then they had to kind of move it back because they weren't finished with some post production, and they moved it to October. But they were very kind in sending us the early episodes, and we were able to watch them as a family in different places. We were all able to watch the videos together, but they would not give us that last episode. I mean, I didn't ask for it, but it was clear that they were keeping it under wraps, and so I saw that finale with everybody else. We didn't know who did it. I thought it was somebody else, but I was well, I mean, I don't want to ruin the series in case anybody didn't see it, but I thought it was a real variation on a theme. So the book is quite different. The book is not a whodunit. It was just a different animal.
And how did it feel like with both Admission and The Undoing to have the changes? How did that feel to you from your original
It
book?
was harder the first time around. I actually, if anybody goes to my website, I think there's an article that's still there under other writing, a piece that I did for New York Magazine with Karen Kroner, who was the screenwriter of Admission. And we kind of did this two-hander article together about, we were the same age, we had similar backgrounds, and the first time we met, uh, she was already the writer of Admission, and she felt guilty that she was sort of taking my baby, and I was terrified. And um, but eventually, you kind of adjust your way of thinking um, into this kind of adaptation mode. And when I read the script of Admission, I was pretty devastated. I mean, it was very tough to see all the changes. But of course, what I wrote, you know, what I wrote was a very internal, cerebral book about a woman having a crisis, basically. She happens to be an admissions officer, and all of these things converge in her life. That wasn't cinematic. I mean, um, what Karen did was she kind of shuffled the entire story, and she moved some things way up to the front, which were big secrets in the novel. It was tough. but it had the knock-on effect of, when I did it again with The Undoing, I was like, whatever, it's totally fine. Do what you need to do.
So we've already talked about the depth you bring to your characters. What did you think about Nicole Kidman and Hugh Grant's performances in The Undoing and the way they brought your characters, albeit slightly different, to life on screen?
Well, they're amazing. They're fantastic. I thought Hugh Grant in particular was just delicious. It was just brilliant. But of course, these were not my characters. My characters were all Jewish. These characters got ethnically adjusted. The story that I heard was that Hugh Grant apparently said to the producers, "Nobody will believe me as a Jewish doctor." So, yeah, I guess they said, "You're right." So suddenly, these people whose last name was Sachs became what were they? Fraser. They became Frasers. They became extremely not Jewish people. So that's all I can say. So in a way that made it easier to watch. It really wasn't my book. It was a variation on my book.
We have a few more questions I want to get through, but I want to remind the audience, please click on the Q&A tab and put your questions in, and we'll be getting to your questions very soon. But with the plot, are you in discussions now about having it made into a series?
Yeah, there's not much that I can say. It has been optioned by a producer. There is an actor who is in the process of committing to play the main role. And the most exciting thing from my perspective is that this time I get to be one of the writers, and I'm really thrilled to try this, to learn how to do this. Um, and it's very exciting for me to be able to learn something new.
That is very exciting. So you mentioned that the plot just poured out of you, the story. And I think you wrote it fairly quickly in a few months, right?
Mhm.
What were there any challenges with writing the novel that you experienced? And you wrote it during the pandemic. What was the impact of that?
I was in such a kind of bad way during this experience. I know that, it wasn't a picnic for any of us. Um, I was super scared. I was super angry. I have elderly parents I was very worried about. It was such an interesting moment to have this kind of propulsive project, because I had a very strong interest in tuning out the rest of the world, which definitely worked in my favor. Um, I mean, it's horrifying to look back at this year and say, well, I obviously had a great pandemic because I wrote a book and it's successful, but I never ever want to have an experience like this again, because of all the things that would have to happen for me to have an experience like this again. Um, so yeah, it wasn't fun, but it was very fast.
And then right on the heels of the plot being released, you've been working on your new book. And so the latecomer, I think you just submitted to the publisher very recently, last weekend.
I have a little more work to do, but I'm almost there. And this is the book I was writing before I read the plot. So I've done a lot of rounds with this book, but I think it's going to be great when I finally finish it.
And you obviously love to read other authors' books since you started Book the Writer, which brings together people for in-person and discussions and also global virtual discussions. And I've participated in some of them. You told Scott Turow when you spoke to him, "I'm addicted and excited when I open a book." So how do you pick books for your Book the Writer group? And do you think you're more critical regarding issues like character and development and the plot since you're a writer?
I probably am. I probably am. But the other side of that is that I'm probably also reading every book with one little antenna going, what can I learn? What does this person know how to do that I don't know how to do? I'm fascinated by great writing and great stories and great characters. And sometimes you don't find all of those things in one book, but there's still something that you can learn from. As to how I pick the books, it's a real combination. I mean, if I admire a person's work and I know they have a book coming out, I'll write to them. Sometimes I'll just like write to people I admire, like like I've got the books for the summer here. Like we're doing this book with Alan Zweibel. This guy, I mean, I've known who this guy is for 30 years. He was one of the original Saturday Night Live writers. He's worked with everybody. And when I heard he had a new memoir, My Life Helping Funny People Be Funnier, I wrote to him, just through his website. Hi, I do this thing. Would you like to do it? I'm often amazed at the people who say yes, but it's a special experience for most of us. Maybe not David Sedaris, maybe not Gillian Flynn, but for most of us to be able to sit in a room with 20 people who have just bought and read your book and are about to have a really intelligent conversation about it is a very big deal. And it's rare. And so I guess that's why some of the people have said yes to us.
And we'll be sharing information in our follow-up email so people can join Book the Writer and hear about all Jean's upcoming talks. So for you, what are 2 or 3 of your favorite books and what's on your nightstand right now?
Well, I read so quickly that you have to be fast to catch what's on my nightstand because it won't be there too long. But right now on my nightstand is our book for tomorrow night. We're doing Paul Rudnick's novel Playing the Palace tomorrow night, so I'm finishing this. I'm also reading a book about the plague in turn of the century San Francisco called The Barbary Plague, which is a fascinating book. And I always have a book on tape going at the same time, so I just started The Midnight Library, which I've been seeing all over the place. I literally just started it this afternoon, so don't ask me. Don't ask me anything.
Do you have to do a lot of prep work before each of these talks in addition to reading the book?
I do, yeah, because in case people are shy, I want to make sure that we have enough questions. But my goal in Book the Writers pop-up book groups is to get as close to conversation as Zoom will let us get, just as we do in when we're meeting together in the rooms.
And
So
in many ways, the virtual context of Zoom has given you an even broader audience around the world. I was on one where you interviewed another Princetonian, David Duchovny from London.
yeah, yeah. I was just thinking of David Duchovny when you said that because we had a lot of women and they were all women. Isn't that strange? They were
Yeah,
all women and they were from
surprising.
all over the world. Um, but we had a fantastic pop-up book group with Sophie Ward, who's an English novelist that I admire. I'd never met. Um, and so we did that. She was from London. We just did Anne Enright, the great Irish novelist. So this is a real advantage of Zoom that you can be anywhere and the audience can be anywhere. And it is kind of cool. I'm going to miss that actually.
Well, you should keep it up in addition to the in-person.
I'm working on it. If somebody has a kid who knows how to help me do a hybrid of in the room and online, send them my way because
Well, we're actually working on that right now at the Princeton Club because we'll be doing both. So
okay, good,
happy to help you with
good,
that.
good,
And
good.
And I will also say that in our chat, everybody, you've got a link to sign up for Book the Writer,
Thanks.
also links to order Jean's book. So last question from
Oh, I
me.
see. Thank you.
Yeah, and last question from me, and then we're going to go to our audience, is what advice do you have for anyone in our audience who is an aspiring author? What do you wish you'd been told early on in your career?
Oh, that's a really good question. Okay, well, the question, the answer that everybody expects is right, 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 right. Of course, you have to write if you want to be a writer, but people don't talk enough about reading. I mean, it's astonishing how many people aspire to be writers who do not read. you just you need to read, you need to read a lot, you need to want to read, you need to care about reading. And I would also add that in addition to reading good books, which of course you should do, you should read bad books. I read so much crap growing up. I mean, I read the Danielle Steeles, I read the what's her name, she just died, Princess Days, Judith Krantz. I mean, if you don't read bad books, you won't be able to recognize the difference. And besides, bad books are a lot of fun. So, you just need to read everything. And the other thing that I would say, especially to young people, is it doesn't, we are so lucky, as writers. It doesn't matter if you haven't written a novel by age 18, 20, 25, 30. Nobody expects a writer to be a prodigy, and our work gets better. I mean, if you came to me and said, "My dream is to be a ballerina," I would say, "Why aren't you in class right now? You don't have time to go to the movies. You need to be in class. If you want to be a gymnast, you need to be, if you haven't done it by the time you're 20, stop, it's not going to happen." But for us, we get that long runway and we need it because I have never I've never read a great novel by, I think, anyone under 25. I mean, even that is remarkable. So give yourself time. Don't freak out if you haven't made it by the time you're, a young adult. Um, Take your time, think, read, and don't worry about publishing yet.
One of our viewers wants to know, how do you stay motivated to write?
Well, I think it's a myth that you have to have these habits and rituals. And, I know Jennifer Egan has this thing where she has to write 1,200 words a day. I am not like that. When you're in the middle of a book, you're writing. When you're not in the middle of a book, don't beat yourself up. Go to the beach, read Danielle Steele, go to the movies, raise your kids, do live your life, because it takes time for, those ideas to build up again. And when I stopped kind of beating myself up about the times when I wasn't writing, um, I was able to recognize that these were vital interludes between books. And, I look back at the books that I've written, and there are a lot of them. And yet, I would say that most days of those years, I felt, like I wasn't working hard enough. So the books get written. They may not get written on the schedule that you have in mind, but
How many nuggets are in your brain right now that are going to be germinating into a book going forward?
none, because my brain is full of the latecomer right now. There's nothing there. And when I finish it, there will be nothing there for a while until hopefully something else will be there.
Okay, that's great. And we answered a lot of the questions through our discussion. If anybody else has another pressing question, feel free to put it in. I'll add that with her husband, in addition to her work writing books, Korelitz, Jean adapted James Joyce's The Dead as an immersive theatrical event. And it was performed at New York's American Irish Historical Society for 7-week runs in 2016, 2017, and 2018. So talk about having a diverse skill set.
I didn't know I had it until I tried to do it. I just had this idea, oh, somebody should put the dead on in this amazing building. And I went to my sister, who, unlike me, had always wanted to be a theater producer. And she said, well, that's an interesting idea. And when we started talking about it to producers and other and theater companies, everybody just said, where's the script? Who's doing the script? When will we see a script? And I thought, oh, I just better write the script now. But luckily, I'm married to somebody who knows a hell of a lot more about James Joyce than I did. And so we did it together, and it was the first time we've ever collaborated on anything except for our children. And it was just a magical experience, and we did it for 3 years. Um, and then we lost our venue. So unless and until we find another venue, maybe the Princeton Club wants to let us move in for 6 weeks over the holidays at the most popular time of the year to use the club. But if anybody knows of a beautiful mansion in Manhattan that it's just hanging around, not being used or enjoyed, please give me a call.
And is Paul one of your first readers? Do you have him read chapters and give you pointers and advice?
Paul is not a natural reader of fiction. Fiction is not his love. He definitely reads everything eventually, but he's not my reader. I have a wonderful friend who lives in California. She was my Dartmouth classmate. She's also a novelist, and she, from back in the 1990s, has been the person who reads everything for me.
Isn't that wonderful?
Yeah.
So we have another person asking about what advice you have for aspiring college age writers.
I don't think it's any different. Just you mean people who think they might want to be writers eventually. You know, Princeton has one of the greatest assemblages of teachers of writing. So if you have a kid who's lucky enough to be at Princeton, my best advice would be to make use of the incredible people who are teaching there. But I went to Dartmouth, which was in many ways a great college. At that time, it was not all that serious about creative writing. I think they had one poet, maybe, and really there wasn't much going on there in creative writing, and it didn't have any terrible impact on me that I did not have a great teacher of creative writing. So, study literature, study history, study religion, study anything.
It all informs the work. Well, we have another interesting question. What do you do when your character and plot seem to be going off in their own direction, not where you plan?
I would say pay attention because, some part of your subconscious may know something that you don't know yet. But if they're really going wrong, then, just turn things around. But sometimes it's useful to sort of listen to what, I mean, I don't want to get all arty and spiritual about, the character is speaking to you. I don't think that really happens. But sometimes there are parts of your brain that know things that other parts do not. And it can be interesting to hear what those parts might be.
Well, thank you so much, Jean, for joining us tonight to share your candid experience and thoughtful insights about your incredible books and the writing process. We hope it sparked some creative thinking among our audience to write. And we really want to congratulate you on becoming a New York Times bestselling author with The Plot. We also want to thank the Princeton Club of New York, Princeton Arts Alumni, Princeton in Hollywood, and Conscious Capitalism New York City for co-sponsoring this program. And a big thank you to all of you who joined us this evening. The Princeton Club is recording this talk, and we'll be sending everyone the link to this talk and to purchase Jean's books, and also to join Book the Writer if you haven't captured it from the chat. And we have many other terrific programs planned and hope that you'll join us. Thank you again, Jean, for your time.
Thank you, Wendy. Thank you for asking me, and thanks, Princeton.
We're getting lots of notes saying what a wonderful program it was, and we really appreciate your tremendous insights tonight. And of course, thank you for your wonderful books that really enrich our lives. And thank you to everyone in the audience for joining us tonight.